Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus. Qatar is a small Arab country with a palpable effect on Jewish issues like anti-Zionism in our classrooms, negative reporting about Israel in the media, and support for Hamas. I will discuss this and other things with my guest today, Jordan Cope. Jordan Cope is an attorney and serves as Director of Policy Education at Stand With Us, an international nonpartisan education organization that supports Israel and combats anti-Semitism. See also www.standwithus.com. At another organization, the Middle East Forum, Jordan has done extensive research on influence campaigns of Qatar and its ties to terrorist groups. He contributes frequently to international media, both on air and in print. Jordan, welcome to Never Again Is Now podcast.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Honor to have you on too. Thank you for coming. So, before I ask you about Qatar, can you please tell us about your work at Stand With Us, especially the legal work you and that organization are currently doing against anti-Semitism?
Of course. So, as Director of Policy Education, a lot of my work also involves beyond just strictly the legal sphere, even though I'm also a staff attorney. So, when it comes to the policy side, I proudly help resource legislative efforts throughout the greater United States when it comes to combating BDS, resourcing anti-BDS legislation, and also helping resource legislation in general to fight anti-Semitism by helping codify the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism into state law, helping law enforcement officers and state officials combat anti-Semitic discrimination, which is already illegal in the 50 states. However, many state officials don't actively know how anti-Semitism manifests in contemporary times. And so this definition is critical for helping elucidate and illuminate how anti-Semitism manifests currently and presently. When it comes to the law, I proudly help as well when it comes to particularly niche matters of law, helping consult when it comes to international law, when it comes to the Anti-Terrorism Act, helping when it comes to interesting lawsuits, such as the material support for terrorism case that we helped resource against Al Jazeera, which is a Qatari state-sponsored media outlet and arguably one of the main media outlets when it comes to propagating anti-Semitic myths or narratives, at least. So in regards to that, that's how I've helped be a significant help, but also in addition to our efforts to combat anti-Semitism at the UN. For instance, right now we're trying to get Stand With Us accredited to speak in the Human Rights Council in future proceedings. But on top of that, to hold potentially anti-Semitic actors accountable in the United Nations, such as the Commission of Inquiry on Israel, which is one of the most biased bodies currently active in the United Nations, having issued reports incredibly biased against Israel, which the United States itself has rejected. So we have led efforts to hold people accountable on that commission, also spotlighting efforts in the UN priorly accepting funds from Qatari state-affiliated charities of concern.
So those are all crucial issues that you mentioned and that you are active against. So when we look at the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the definition of anti-Semitism, it involves also certain criticism of Israel, not all, but certain criticism of Israel. Now, there are people who argue that by using that definition, you shut down any criticism of Israel. You shut down the debates about Israel's policies. How would you argue against that argument.
I would reframe how the question was phrased. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism perfectly allows criticism of Israel. In fact, it actually explicitly mentions that criticism leveraged against Israel that is similar to that against any other country is perfectly fine. However, it also acknowledges it's the manner of how one might potentially try to criticize Israel when they deploy anti-Semitic tropes on top of that to criticize Israel. That's often when a line is crossed. Anybody can criticize Israel. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism recognizes that, but it also understands that if one deploys a manner in which they're actively trying to destroy Israel and promoting the destruction of Israel, and or if they are applying anti-Semitic tropes in their criticisms of Israel, that's often when that line is crossed. So it's important to understand one could criticize Israel however they please. The definition itself doesn't actually have a binding, it is not a binding mechanism. So the definition itself just simply spotlights when certain types of behavior can transcend into anti-Semitism itself. And when we try to implement the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into law, we make sure very carefully that it's used as a reference for officials to glean when they are considering certain acts of harassment or discrimination that are already illegal. So, in other words, this legislation serves as a reference point for officials to ascertain what unlawful acts are actually being committed. It's not creating a new crime, and it's
I
not
see.
criticizing speech against Israel, even anti-Semitic speech, which is, however distasteful, is perfectly allowed under the laws of the United States.
Okay. So if it becomes law, it doesn't become criminal law, is what you're saying.
What I am saying is that the IHRA legislation throughout the United States, it doesn't criminalize speech. Anybody can say anything anti-Semitic, however distasteful it is. It will not criminalize that speech. However, if one commits an illegal act, such as discrimination, such as harassment, such as a hate crime, an actual act, then the legislation can be used to propel law enforcement officers, state officials, to have to consider the definition in their assessment whether that act was in fact illegal and to understand whether anti-Semitism played an element in that illegal act.
I see. So, uh, where has that definition been accepted in law?
The definition has now been accepted previously by multiple presidential administrations on both the left and the right side of the political spectrum. It's been adopted in some way by the past three presidents, I believe. But on top of that, the definition's been adopted by approximately 40 to 50 countries around the world. It's been adopted, I believe, by approximately 35 plus states in the United States so far. And we've proudly helped at Stand With Us help resource IHRA legislative efforts in multiple states throughout the United States, especially in Georgia relatively recently, an executive order in New Mexico, and of course, in many other states. We try to work with both sides of the political spectrum and help them recognize the pressing need to address anti-Semitism right now, especially as anti-Semitic incidents have skyrocketed post October 7th, incidents being reported as having skyrocketed by upwards of 300% in certain eras following October 7th. So it's especially critical right now that people understand what anti-Semitism is, but also understand how anti-Semitism has evolved over time. And that's what the IHRA definition, with its 11 examples, does so well. And so our state officials, our law enforcement, they need to better understand how to stamp out anti-Semitism in the contemporary, because how anti-Semitism manifests now is very different from what our grandfathers would have seen in Nazi Europe.
Yes. It is more about Israel, I guess. Um, so um, today is a National Commemoration Day in the Netherlands, where I'm from originally. National Commemoration Day of those who died in World War II and in wars after that, Jews and others who died in World War II. And so the king and the queen come out and to the ceremony at the national monument that commemorates World War II, in the capital of the Netherlands. And that monument this morning was sprayed with red paint, and it said genocide. Would you consider that anti-Semitic, within the definition of the IHRA?
Are you referring to a statue commemorating a Jewish figure or Jewish victims in the Holocaust?
It
Just to
it
understand.
includes Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but also people who died in resistance or in the military fighting the Germans. Everybody who died, every Dutch person who died during World War II because of the war.
I think we would have to understand the intent of the person who engaged in that unlawful act of vandalism on that statue. And at least just at a first thought, as me personally thinking here, I personally would think that would amount to an act of anti-Semitism. It's obvious what the statue represents, who it is commemorating, most prominently Jewish people, and it is binding them simply to the allegation of genocide. It is trying to allegate to the entirety of the Jewish people a false allegation, one amounting to modern day blood libel, especially given Israel's acts in this current war, not to just keep civilian casualty counts, however tragic they might be in any form, to a low when comparing the figures to other accounts of modern day contemporary warfare, but also Israel's efforts to spare lives when it comes to millions of messages being issued, evacuation notices, humanitarian corridors, increased aid during the war to make sure that aid was optimized, even if the UN didn't adequately distribute it to try to sustain innocent Palestinian civilians in the war. It does not amount to genocide, of course, under the international treaties that define genocide and under other international legal definitions, but it is certainly applying a false allegation to the entirety of the Jewish people. And as you would see in the IRA definition, accusing Jews as a people being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews, would amount, of course, to anti-Semitism. Um, and as we've seen in this current war, that's a false allegation, but one that some might believe might apply to one or more Jewish people. And of course, the Jewish people do not bear involvement for that. So, to answer your question more shortly, yes.
Okay, thank you. So let's now discuss Qatar. Can you give us some general background about the country, its geography, population, economy, culture, government?
Of course. So Qatar really rose to prominence over the last several decades. It's situated in the Gulf. It's situated in a rather difficult neighborhood, as we've seen during this war. It borders Saudi Arabia. It borders across the Persian Gulf on the other side of that waterway, Iran, which has recently attacked Qatar during this war. And if I were to help people understand Qatar best, I would talk about Qatar within the time frame of the last few decades, but also to help people understand that Qatar is an incredibly small country. It's a country of just over 3 million people. The vast majority of people in Qatar are not natives to Qatar. About 15 to 10% of Qatar's population are really Qataris, indigenous Qataris. So to understand Qatar, one has to understand how has it risen to such prominence and why is it such a controversial state actor amidst the Gulf? Why have they had tensions with Saudi Arabia in decades past, both rather long ago and recent, and why with Iran today? So Qatar inherently supports a Islamism that is of a Sunni Salafist variant. And in the Arab Spring, Qatar decided to sponsor various Islamist groups throughout the Arab Spring, supporting insurrections in various countries or the successors that ultimately won these wars. In Egypt, they supported Mohammed Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood movement. In Syria, they supported Ahrar al-Sham and helped ultimately propel eventually the effort to undermine Bashar al-Assad. They supported in Yemen the Al-Islah Party. In Tunisia, they supported a lighter variant of the Muslim Brotherhood called Ennahda. And so, in various ways, they supported Muslim Brotherhood movements throughout the Middle East. And one such of those movements was Hamas, obviously one of the biggest anti-Semitic actors in the world that wants to kill Jews worldwide and destroy the state of Israel. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to establish an Islamic caliphate all throughout the world and to destroy Israel. So Hamas, of course, is in line with the Muslim Brotherhood's vision, and it's exactly an offshoot. So they've given Hamas effectively $2 billion since 2012. They have committed to supposedly supporting humanitarian efforts in Gaza. Qatar was one of the first, it was, I believe, the first state actor to actually visit Gaza in an official state capacity after Hamas's takeover. And while their humanitarian efforts might purport to be in good nature, as I've seen through research time and time again, oftentimes money is diverted from state affiliated charities to terrorist actors or to their affiliates. And we've now seen this with money going to Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula through Qatar's state affiliated Eid charity, as well as going to IHH, that Turkish extremist organization that has sent flotillas to Israel in years past, and of course to Hamas affiliates. And we've also seen the head of the Qatar Committee for the Reconstruction of Gaza, Mohammed El Ahmadi, previously visiting with members of the Islamic Jihad. Now, if Qatar is to claim that it is playing a diplomatic role in the Gaza Strip and it is engaging with political wings of terrorist groups, one has to ask why it has engaged with a group that is explicitly non-political and that is strictly military in its focus of destroying Israel. So that's in the contemporary sense, but to briefly talk about viewing Qatar in the lens of time, I would focus on Qatar in three different eras. One, 1995. That's when Qatar's soft power campaign really begins. During the year when the emir's father, the prior emir, seized power from his own father. This created a lot of discontent with a lot of the Gulf countries in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, like Bahrain. And even though at the time those countries were largely Islamist, Sunni in nature altogether, it created inherent tensions. If you disrespect the monarchy in one country, you disrespect the sanctity of the monarchy and the line of succession and all. And the following year in Operation Abu Ali, Saudi Arabia supposedly with the UAE was involved in a counter coup attempt that failed. So Qatar realized at that time that it needed allies beyond the Gulf. It started appealing to the West. Within a year of the Qatar coup in 1995, Qatar introduced a lot of significant soft power campaigns. They introduced the Al Jazeera Media Network, as we know it, one of the most prominent news networks now in the world, broadcast to 450 million homes. We saw Qatar create the Qatar Foundation, which is largely responsible now for funding not just educational initiatives in Qatar, but also American universities. We saw at the time Qatar beginning construction on the Al Udeid military base, which is now one of the most important US military bases in the entire region of the Middle East, even though Qatar often does not allow America to use that base for its operations in its greatest hours of need. So that was era number one, as I explained. And we also saw the US Qatar Business Council, even though it's not officially a state entity, they also emerged effectively within or around a year of that coup. And they lobby American politicians, they bring them on trips to Qatar, and effectively they try to convince and entrench America into a strong Qatar friendship on the basis of business interests. So the next phase that I think we need to focus on, so we understand why Qatar ultimately fears relations in its Gulf region and understands the need to appeal to the West, to outreach to the West, and why it ultimately tries to flirt with the West. But also, we need to put that in context with the wars on terrorism years following 9/11 and following 2003. So, important to remember is that in the mid 1990s, Qatar actually hosted the mastermind behind 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And supposedly, when the US went to close in on his arrest in Qatar, Qatari officials tipped off Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM. He fled to Pakistan, and then eventually he planned the 9/11 attacks. And as we say, the rest, in this case, unfortunately, is history. And so, what we saw as the wars on terrorism were unfolding, Qatar would eventually build more and more on its soft power initiatives, but in a way that was critically anti American in the Gulf. We saw Qatar found Al Jazeera, their webpage in English, in 2003, at approximately the same time the wars on terrorism were beginning. We saw Al Jazeera journalists, at least according to Michael Rubin, who reports that Al Jazeera journalists would suddenly show up to booby traps where American troops would be ambushed in these wars. And so we understand inherently that Qatar is anti American. They harbored and enabled supposedly the escape of one of the worst anti American terrorists of all time. On top of that, during the wars on terrorism, one of their journalists explicitly mentioned in a Guardian article about how Al Jazeera journalists were Islamist. And so we see this time and time again, Al Jazeera supporting an Islamism that is inherently anti-American, that oftentimes is supportive of terrorists. And we've seen Al Jazeera in later years actually having terrorists on their payrolls. We've seen Al Jazeera in later years hosting terrorists at their conferences. And we understand that Qatar, when it comes to terrorism, has no problem just consorting with it, but openly celebrating it. We would see eventually Qatar hosting the Taliban's office in Doha. We would see Qatar ultimately helping restore the Taliban to power after affording them safe haven, after giving them luxury accommodations when it came to living in Qatar. It was not just a matter of necessity in the diplomatic world, but a role that Qatar celebrated. It assumes these mediation roles and manipulates them in the favor of their Islamist causes. The last era to focus on, as I mentioned, is the Arab Spring years, when they would support tons and tons of soft power initiatives to promote themselves as patrons of sports, as patrons of culture, as patrons of education. They would sponsor soccer teams, they would sponsor US education, supposedly to the tune of $20 billion, as we've now learned, sponsoring university branches to come and locate satellite campuses in Qatar. They would sign a slew of memorandums of understandings with US universities, many of which I helped recently expose in some of my articles that had yet to receive adequate spotlight. We would see a lot of these efforts appearing, but why? Why was the difference? Why were they all of a sudden introducing Al Jazeera Plus in English, in Spanish, in French, and Arabic, trying largely to appeal to Western progressive young audiences? Why at this time would they introduce Middle East Eye? Qatar at the time, between 2017 and 21, was on the hot seat by much of the Gulf, once again, frustrated with Qatar, but this time for its terrorism, financing, and support throughout the Arab Spring. They would often clash when it came to the proxy wars during the Arab Spring, supporting different factions. And these Gulf countries effectively had enough. Four countries boycotted and blockaded Qatar between those 4 years. And Qatar ultimately launched a lot of these soft power initiatives to combat the pressure that they face from this blockade. But not just that, on top of that, because as Qatar supported Islamist movements throughout the Middle East, inherently contrary to their interests in friendship with the West, they needed to whitewash their support for Muslim Brotherhood movements. And that's largely the reason that I used to explain why Qatar has done what it has done in recent years.
Well, thank you for that let's say, tour through Qatar and its history. Um, why? So, can you explain to me again, maybe, or you did somewhat, but I didn't really understand why. What is in the interest of Qatar? Why is it in the interest of Qatar to support the Muslim Brotherhood?
There are several reasons. First and foremost, Qatar for a long time has supported Sunni Salafist ideology at the state level. That is the sole primary reason why it supports radical Islamist movements, or at least the most direct reason that it does so. There are other reasons, however, as well. When it comes to political survival, as I mentioned, that is one of Qatar's biggest driving motives as well. Time again, they have clashed with various Gulf countries because of varying policies of controversial nature. As I mentioned, at first, it was when Qatar tried to institute a coup in the mid 1990s and succeeded, which angered a lot of other Gulf countries. But more recently, for their support for terrorism, in 2013 or 14, Saudi Arabia and the UAE banned the Muslim Brotherhood. They realized that the Muslim Brotherhood was not just a danger to their political stability, but also to the security and the values of their countries. When it came to Qatar, however, on the other hand, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood allowed Qatar, a rather defiant country, to continue to have a backbone of support from the Islamist world. Many have criticized Saudi Arabia in terms of its vision for progress and for development as anti-Islamic in nature. Qatar, on the other hand, hopes at times to reap what Saudi Arabia ultimately can't, and to reap, I guess, that reputation for being the true bearer of the Islamist cause. And it's why we've seen Qatar invest billions of dollars in Muslim Brotherhood outfits throughout the greater Middle East. And it's why Qatar continues to promote itself as well in every way it can to garner support from Westerners and hopes that it can still retain a relationship outside of the Gulf when and if it needs it.
Um, what is Qatar aiming for regarding Israel, Zionism, and Jews? And what are the main instruments it uses for that?
So Qatar is inherently pro Hamas at the end of the day. It is pro a terrorist group that seeks to destroy Israel, to ethnically cleanse its Jews, and to also kill Jews worldwide. Now, on multiple occasions now, Qatar has mentioned that it would close Hamas's office on Qatari soil. I have yet to see tangible action by Qatar to actually do that. Some of Hamas's most powerful officials redeemed safe haven in Qatar, such as Ismail Haniyeh in years past before he was eventually assassinated while on a trip to Iran. Khalid Mashal supposedly spent time in Qatar. Uh, it is believed that many top prominent Hamas officials are still located in Qatar. Their relationship with Qatar is one they genuinely support. The Emir back in the day said something to the effect on in a CNN interview that Hamas is an important part of the Palestinian people and Qatar supports the Palestinian people. It's very clear where state affiliated charity funding goes in the Gaza Strip, a lot of it at times going to Hamas affiliates. It's very clear, time and time again, Qatar refuses to adequately distance itself from Hamas. It has refused to normalize with Israel, despite relatively adjacently close countries doing so, such as the UAE and Bahrain. Qatar sees itself as a foil, oftentimes, to Saudi Arabia and the UAE's vision for greater progress and liberalism in the Middle East. Qatar supports Muslim Brotherhood affiliates throughout the Middle East and North Africa in their pursuit of the Muslim Brotherhood, which supports a caliphate worldwide. So Israel is inherently incompatible with Qatar's views. And it's to no surprise, as I mentioned earlier, that Hamas fighters or operatives or whatnot have literally appeared on Al Jazeera's payrolls. It's why Al Jazeera frequently refers, Qatar state media, by the way, frequently refers to Israel, at least its writers that have been platformed, as a settler colonial state, as one complicit in ethnic cleansing or apartheid or genocide. That's how Qatar wishes to portray Israel. It frequently is one of the most powerful actors when it comes to undermining Israel's vision and reputation in the entire international community. And it's not just Al Jazeera, but it's also networks affiliated, arguably, with Al Jazeera, such as Middle East Eye, while based technically in London, has significant influence from Al Jazeera. And Middle East Eye itself has helped propagate similar accusations when it comes to Israel. And accusations from Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye have been regularly cited in the United Nations by other think tanks to help support the effort to undermine Israel's right to exist, which is inherently anti-Semitic.
And the 20 billion that go to America's education system, are they also used um, to spread this view of on Israel?
When it comes to understanding the nature of Qatari funding, which is incredibly opaque, one thing is understood that a significant amount of that funding is going to relocate branches of American campuses into satellite branches into what's called Qatar's Education City. Qatar's Education City is a conglomerate of universities, not just from the US, but in some other cases worldwide, to relocate to Qatar to help expose students to academic collaboration, to being in Qatar. And there have been some scandals to emerge that have indicated that sometimes these contracts have implications on the free speech of American students and institutions, but also in Education City, it is reported that there is a center that was devoted to Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the former chief ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, who endorsed suicide bombings, who endorsed attacks against Israelis. So one has to question what's going on that campus. Now, I would double check this. I recall seeing a professor at Education City on Twitter once bragging about, I think, being labeled an anti-Semite or something. I would encourage people, of course, to double check that. But of course, as we've seen worrying things happening, such as a Northwestern University and their contract with the Qatar Foundation. Apparently, following the October 7th attacks, the Qatar Foundation tried to coordinate messaging, reportedly, between the satellite branches and their universities with the Qatar Foundation. And there was a scandal at Northwestern about a statement that the university wanted to issue um, against, I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, a professor in Qatar within their branch in Education City who denied, I believe, that innocent people were being killed or raped or something to that effect. And effectively, the branch located over there objected and they removed that from the university's official statement, the Capstone University statement. So students who go to Qatar, they do not have free speech. They have to comply with the laws of the country. They can't adequately criticize the government in power. Some topics are relatively off theme as well when it comes to criticizing certain religion and whatnot.
So you mentioned a few scandals, but is there a systemic influence of Qatar on American education regarding Zionism, Israel, Jews?
Right. So the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy issued a report recently that has noted a direct effect on increasing anti-Semitism and anti-democratic activity and views on campus. That's almost the exact precise quote that they issued. And so what we have seen is that when it comes to Qatari funding at on American university campuses, there is generally a strong correlation between anti-Semitic activity and between Qatari funding. And if you look at a lot of the universities currently experiencing rising anti-Semitism, one would not be surprised to find significant Qatari funding. We've now seen it at Northwestern. We've seen it at in the Northeast, probably when it comes to Cornell. The universities that receive the most funding from Qatar have generally included Georgetown, Northwestern, Cornell, Texas A&M, Virginia Commonwealth, but it's also there have been significant amounts of MOUs that have been signed in recent years that have garnered effectively no attention. There have been MOUs signed between Qatari state entities with Harvard, with certain institutions at Indiana, at Michigan, at Wisconsin, at Bridgewater State, at Idaho, excuse me, at Bridgewater State, at Idaho State, I believe, and the University of Utah, many different universities throughout the United States. And I'm sure there are many more MOUs that have yet to have been revealed. In my home state in Texas, we've also seen worrying signs of Qatari influence in our education system. We've seen now the University of Houston Clear Lake, their diplomacy institute was actually founded in partnership with the Ministry of Qatar. We've seen at Rice University, which has had some anti-Semitic incidents in relatively recently. We've seen that there is a Qatari royal family member on the Baker Institute's board. And one has to ask, how has Qatar managed to infiltrate our education system so significantly? Why are we seeing youth in the United States becoming so radicalized, not just at the education level, but also in the K through 12 level, where the Qatar Foundation is offering grants to support curriculums, especially in Arabic study programs, at times promoting maybe materials that would be objectionable when it comes to slandering or defaming Israel, and not just in Arabic, but in their Masdar curriculum and whatnot. So it's definitely something that we need to be aware of. We need to better audit our education system, understand where those funds are going, because frankly, as we speak, there is a radicalism problem. It is not just through the Qatar Foundation, but also through soft power, as I mentioned, AJ Plus, promoting anti-American and anti-Israel themes and progressive talking points designed to appeal to our youth, which are very deceiving.
So, Jordan, when when I watch the news about, for instance, the war between Iran and Israel, as of last year, um, or the war between the United States and Iran, as of this year and last year, I see, and I watch different news channels, American news channel. I'm talking about television. I watch different news stations on American television. I watch different news stations on English, British television, and also on the Dutch television. And what strikes me, especially in the UK and in the Netherlands, is that the state news, which is supposed to be neutral, and then I look at Al Jazeera English. Also, I watch that too, and then I see a big overlap between what and how Al Jazeera English reports about those wars during those wars taking place and the reporting on the BBC, on the Dutch state news, NOS, not so much on the American news channels. Do you recognize what I'm saying, or am I saying something that you don't recognize?
I certainly think there are issues inherently with bias against Israel when it comes to Middle East reporting. And some of these Western media outlets actually have partnerships with Qatari state institutions. If you look in years past, CNN, for instance, had partnered with the Doha Forum. Qatar, at the end of the day, has a relationship with the Brookings Institute, used to at least have a relationship with the Brookings Institute, which had a campus in Qatar. And so there was, at the time, the contract was signed by Martin Indyk, and I believe the contract was to be renewed every certain amount of years. But of course, in some way, that contract must have had influence when it came to limiting criticism against Qatar or being favorable in order to receive more funding in the future. At least a prediction. So one has to ask, why have so many of these? Qatar also once flat out published an article which they sponsored in Politico. So we're seeing major media outlets in various ways being co-opted or partnering with Qatari state-affiliated institutions. And as somebody who spends multiple months a year in Europe, oftentimes in Germany, I've seen the reporting coming out, not just on the Middle East, but on America. And it is so incredibly biased. It is so incredibly anti-Israel, so incredibly anti-American. The media in America is a little bit better than it is in Europe, but unfortunately, it's veering in the wrong direction. How can one forget how many people circulated that Al Ahli hospital myth, that blood libel, when people accused Israel of having killed, was it what, 400 people from a supposedly IDF missile, which ultimately turned out to have actually been a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that was misfired that might have killed approximately 12 people. Nearly the entire world spread it. Why? They relied on sources coming from the Middle East. They relied surely on Al Jazeera, which was one of the bigger media outlets that circulated that myth at the time. I don't recall Al Jazeera issuing an apology enough that was public enough. Al Jazeera, as well, when it comes to their terrorists on their payroll, have effectively just denied their existence as terrorists, even though there's significant evidence pointing to the contrary. So when it comes to reporting, one every year needs to look at the Doha Debates Partnerships, which is a state-sponsored Qatari media effort to convene thought leaders, political leaders, when it comes to discussions. And oftentimes these Doha Forum events often involve topics specifically about American and Israel related themes, oftentimes drawing attention to Israel and American related themes. And often at times, these events, if I recall, have even been emceed by past journalists from Al Jazeera and from Turkey's state-sponsored media outlet TRT, which is arguably one of the world's most not new, but one of the world's most dangerous media outlets when it comes to anti-Israel narratives that we are now seeing today, and which recalls the Qatar-Turkey axis, which is now largely behind supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and promoting narratives to discredit Israel almost at every corner.
Yeah, well, it's a bleak picture you're giving us of the influence of Islamist Qatar on our media, on our education system. It's huge, as you explain, and it's very important we understand that. Um, one specific question about that, we see a sudden resistance against Israel at the conservative side of the American electorate. And often that is explained by several factors, a big one being the influence of Tucker Carlson, the media, the social media person, influencer, Tucker Carlson. And it has been said that he has ties with Qatar, that he has a house there, that he has been paid by Qatar through Shell organizations. Is that something you have any knowledge, any factual knowledge about?
I will say Qatar's efforts to influence the West are by no means on one side of the political spectrum, even though significantly when it came to Europe with the supposed bribery efforts, even though those politicians were largely left-leaning, Qatar has also significantly tried to influence the right when it comes to the United States. Al Jazeera actually tried to create a channel called Al Jazeera Rightly to appeal more to the conservative audience in the United States. Tucker Carlson in the past has been referred to as Tucker Qatarlson due to his ties to Qatar. He has announced plans to buy a home in Qatar. On top of that, he previously, I believe, as indicated through official listings, partnered at least on one occasion with a Qatari entity on a media project. And so we see politicians, as I mentioned earlier, being flown out to Qatar via the US Qatar Business Council, which claims that it's an independent organization, but on trips has introduced American leaders to the Emir and to other Qatari state officials trying to promote business between Qatar and the United States. And we've seen a significant amount of those participants coming from also the Republican side of the spectrum, as have they from the Democrat side of the spectrum. So we see a lot of people in the United States waking up about China or about Iran. And somebody asked me the other day, well, why not also Qatar? To which I thought the answer probably lies in the fact that in America, the Republicans have expressed grievances significantly with China and with Iran, and also on the Democrat side of the spectrum, likewise. But when it comes to Qatar, it continues to remain amongst significant circles of Americans a blind spot because on the liberal side, many oftentimes focus on the grievances of Saudi Arabia that are often expounded by Qatar in Qatari media, at least in years past. And because of their focus and hyper attention on Saudi Arabia, they don't focus so much on Qatar. When it comes to the conservative side of the spectrum, well, there are some conservatives who have gone to Qatar, who recall our military base being there, but forget to realize that Qatar often does not allow us to use those bases in our critical times of war. And so there are blind spots on both sides, sometimes perhaps through de facto bribery, as some might call it, but also because of other political misunderstandings that distract or blind people from the reality and the danger that Qatar is to the West. Now, you mentioned previously something along the lines of, well, how non optimistic a lot of my commentary has suggested about the future of Qatar. There is one potential opportunity for optimism. I'm not sure how great it is, but given the fact that Iran has recently attacked Qatar, Qatar might realize that it has to realign itself in terms of its position in the Middle East. Iran used to be, in essence, a safe haven for Hamas officials whom Qatar supports. But when the blockade happened, when those four countries boycotted and blockaded Qatar, Qatar Airways, which was another big, significant component of its soft power strategy in terms of how it expanded the airlines during these years, even though it was invented in years prior, Qatar Airways would fly over Iran. It would use Iran's airspace, I believe sometimes even landing in Iran and giving landing fees to Iran. They share a gas field. The world's single largest gas field is shared between Iran and Qatar. With the Strait of Hormuz being closed, Qatar is really in a bind right now. Qatar provides significant amounts of liquefied natural gas to the outside world, and the Strait of Hormuz being closed and having recently having been attacked by Iran, it's possible that Qatar might have never calculated the consequences of their own actions, their terrorism financing, and their realignment. So perhaps there's room for opportunity with Qatar in the future, but I'm very skeptical, very hesitant, and Qatar will need to put word to action. They will need to close the Hamas office. They will need to stop harboring terrorists on their soil. They'll need to stop harboring terrorist financiers. And America ultimately will need to play a role in that by tightening the relationship with Qatar and making clear that Qatari funding and US universities, especially when it goes undeclared to the tune of $100 million at Texas A&M alone, has no place to continue in America. States as well will need to ensure better foreign lobbying registration and disclosure laws to remain that American politics remain for the American people.
Well, those are very concrete and excellent recommendations, I think. Is there anything our listeners as individuals can do to contribute to making those recommendations of yours a reality to stop the influence of Qatar on our crucial areas in our societies?
Of course, I think everybody, a lot of listeners here, will be living in cities where there is significant Qatari influence. If you look at cities alone in Texas, emergency responders have trained with Qatari officials or have been flown out even at times to Qatar for meetings or trainings or whatnot. The Dallas police chief, not too long ago, was recently in Qatar. The mayor of Dallas recently had meetings with the US Qatar Business Council, which once again is technically a private organization, but affiliated somewhat with Qatar. When it comes to your cities, there are significant likelihoods that your institutions, your representatives are meeting or partnering with people representing Qatari interests, which are inherently not aligned with democratic viewpoints and oftentimes are counterintuitive to the national security interests of the United States and to Israel. People need to wake up, they need to realize, and they need to do basic research. A lot of this is publicly available knowledge and press releases and whatnot to see which institutions in their city and in their state have ties to Qatar. And that simply begins by typing in the city or the state where they're from and Qatar and seeing what comes up. It's that simple. People then need to challenge that influence in their institutions. They need to demand their city, their state, and their elected officials at the federal level to challenge Qatari influence in their constituencies, and they need to make clear that they support democratic values, American national security interests, and the greater freedom of the American people. It's that simple.
Well, Jordan, thank you. Those are excellent recommendations that we can all embrace and take action on ourselves. Thank you so much for this interview. This was an amazing amount of factual knowledge that you shared with us, and so important and so it's so underrepresented in the news and in the sources that we consume. But it's crucial to know about it. So it was very educational what you shared with us. Thank you so much for that. I also want to thank our listeners for listening. If you would like to know more about Never Again Is Now podcast, please look us up at our podcast channels on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeart. You will also find former episodes of the podcast there that you can watch or watch again if you want. And I would like to end with making the call to all our listeners to take action in the way that Jordan has just gave us recommendations for at the end of his interview, and to speak up against all anti Semitism when you come across it. Thank you.